sitting there listening to Stanley describe my upbringing and where I come from, and I'm reminded of how far the United States Senate is, both figuratively and literally, from where I come from not so long ago. And yet I always tell people that I consider myself to be a child of privilege, with two distinct privileges. The first is I was raised by a strong and stable family, which is a tremendous head start in life. And the other is that I was born an American during the American century. And let's not forget what that means. Actually, America can trace its greatness back to its founding, when extraordinary men who were alive at the same place at the same time at that moment wrote these words that all people are created equal, that those rights that make us equal come from God, not from government. The job of the government is to protect those rights, and that any government that fails to protect those rights loses its legitimacy. And from that sprang the miracle called America, a place where we had both the freedom and the opportunity to pursue your dreams, a beacon for all the world. People all over this planet looked to America and said, in our country we can't be who we were meant to be. But there's this place where it doesn't matter where you come from. Anyone from anywhere can accomplish anything. And that unleashed a creativity and an innovation unseen in all of human history. And by the early part of the last century, America's rise was unmistakable and unstoppable. It remained a great power in all the earth. America became prosperous and freer more prosperous and freer than any people that had ever walked the earth by the early part of the last century. America became a great power. But the world's always had great powers. What made America different is that unlike many of these other societies in human history that rose to that level, Americans carried with themselves a sense of responsibility, almost a sense that to those who much is given, much is expected. That our power didn't come just for our own self-fulfillment and enjoyment, but with it an obligation to make the world a better place. And that explains why Americans went to Europe and defeated Nazis, and then rebuilt a destroyed continent, did the same in Asia. That explains why Americans took on communism wherever it spread throughout the world. Ultimately, not just the Iron Curtain, but a wall in Berlin fell as well. That explains why every time there's a natural disaster, Americans are the first to respond. Why whenever a tyranny raises its head, American voices are the first to condemn it. These things describe the American century better than anything else. That's the era that I grew up in, that's the era that you grew up in. And that's the nation that we have known all our lives. Now we're in a new century, and a new time where so much feels different from what it once was before. We're still a prosperous people, but our prosperity seems a little bit uneven and maybe in doubt. We're still free, but increasingly we're asked to surrender freedom in exchange for security. And America is still influential all over the world, but there are some who say we are less influential than ever, and that others are becoming more influential at our expense. It's a time of great uncertainty where people who have done everything they've been told they needed to do to succeed are finding it difficult to succeed. People have always learned and been told that if you go to college, get an education, you'll go out and find a job that can support your family. And yet there are millions of people across this country that did just that and are struggling to make ends meet. Their house is worth half as much as it was just a few years ago. So is their mutual fund and their 401k. Americans feel uncertain about the future. We have two roads before us, and it's the reason why I ran for the United States Senate, because I understood clearly, and I think you understand clearly, that America has two choices before it. And there are only two choices. And what we are debating right now is which one of those two choices we're going to make. Which one of these two roads are we going to take? One road is sadly the one I fear we're on. It's the one where we don't realize the historic significance of the moment that we're living, and we do nothing. And indeed, America declines. Indeed, America loses influence in the world, and the America we grew up in ceases to exist. That's the road we're on because there are too many people up here that have decided that their political careers are more important than the future of our country. That's the road that we're on because too many people up here have decided that the issues of the moment are not nearly as important as the campaign that awaits. That's the road that we're on because there's actually people up here that doubt the American century ever existed. Although all they have to do is ask me, because I would not be in the U.S. Senate had there not been an American century. So that's the road that I fear we're on right now. There is an alternative. There is another way, and it's not too late for us to choose it. We can choose to make this century an American century as well. There's no reason why we can't. We can build here a country better than the one we knew over the last 100 years. A society where Americans are more prosperous than ever because our children and our grandchildren invent and build products that they can sell to more people in the world than ever before. More people than ever before will be able to afford to buy the things we invent and build. An America whose government lives within its means, but whose means are considerable, and as a result can continue to do the things that government is supposed to do, because it's not wasting money doing things government should not have to do. An America that's still a clear voice throughout the world, on behalf of what is right and on behalf of justice. You see, the problems that the world faces are so big that no single nation by themselves can solve them. It takes coalitions of nations to solve them. The coalitions have to be pulled together, and coalitions have to be led. And who will lead these coalitions and these movements? The United Nations, who's only good at two things. Number one, condemning Israel, and number two, cashing our checks that we send. Who will lead these coalitions? The international community? The United States has to lead these coalitions. We can use our power and our influence to encourage other nations to use their growing power and influence to speak out and deal with these issues that we face across our planet. We can have that kind of century, but there are certain things we'll have to do. Now, some believe that the price we have to pay to do it is too high. I would argue that the price of not doing it is even higher. Others will argue that the situations that we face are too difficult to overcome, that the impediments to a new American century are so great that we cannot surmount them. Well, they're ignorant of our history. They're wrong. You see, even the American century was one of great challenges. We forget that in the American century there was an extraordinary depression, an economic depression, that wiped out entire cities and communities. And in the aftermath, a nation weary after that depression had to go fight a world war and defeat what appeared at the time to be two unstoppable enemies. And then a nation tired of a world war had to go out and fight a Cold War that some days was not so cold at all, and lost young men and women in both Korea and Vietnam. A nation struggling with all these things had to struggle in the 1960s with facing up to a tragic legacy of racism in this country. A civil rights movement that had to face police dogs in Birmingham, that had to face the death of little children and bombings of churches, and that had to face political leaders who justified these things. A nation that had to witness the assassination of one president and the resignation of another. A nation that faced great challenges, even in the American century. Because the great story of America is not a story of a nation of unprecedented, it's not the story of a nation of uninterrupted prosperity and peace. It's the story of a nation that confronted challenges and overcame them. And the story of the American people has never been the story of a people that always got it right in every instance. It's the story of a people that in the end always got it right. Over the last century, that is who we have been. That is what America has been. And that is who and what we can be again. There's no reason why we can't, if only we want to. The road before us, if we want it, will not be easy. There are things we're going to have to do. We have to realize that we have built more government than we can afford. And it's time to face that reality. We have to realize that what creates jobs in America are not politicians. It's the everyday person with a hope, a dream, and the drive to pursue it. And the government's job is to make it easier for them to do that, not harder. And we all as individuals have to realize that the greatest contributions we will make is not in our workplace, but in our communities and in our homes. In our role as father, and mother, husband and wife, neighbor and friend, community leader, you will do more to contribute to the future of our country than our individual jobs. If we can accept these things, if we do this, if we embrace our heritage and what it has meant, and apply it towards our future, we can accomplish something here that's difficult to imagine is even possible. We can accomplish a history, a future that's brighter and better than our history. But we have to want to do it. And that is the debate that we're having in Washington today. Are we prepared to do what those who came before us did? Whatever it takes to create the new American century. I, for one, am. I'm encouraged that we've been joined up here by others that are as well. And that's what you're working towards electing people and being a voice on behalf of what America is and what America should continue to be. What the role of government should be in our lives and what the role of America should be in the world. This is the great cause of our time. This is the central issue of our moment. And I will conclude by saying two things. Three things. How's that? Number one, the world needs America as much as it ever has. Just know that there are a lot of people around the world that don't like who we are, but they admire what we are. The world witnessed the American century too. And they want some of that for themselves. The last two things I would say to you is that in this historic moment in human history, where the world is changing faster than it ever has, where in 2 years so much can change that you don't even recognize the world you once knew. This is no time to stop being American. And this is no time to stop being Americans. So I am grateful for your invitation and the opportunity to speak to you today. I'll continue to work hard on these issues for you. I'm encouraged by your support and your warm mood. Thank you.